Welcome to the show. How you doing? Oh,
Good. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Can you hear
no
me okay?
worries. Yeah, you're all good. I'd love to start. Quick background on yourself would be great, but also just can you take us through the very the very early prehistory of this lawsuit? We'll build up
Sure.
to your analysis that you dropped today.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, great to meet.
Loving the podcast. So I have been doing tech policy in DC for 20 years or so. I spent a dozen years at Google in their Washington office.
Oh, wow.
And about 4 years ago, started a group called Chamber of Progress, which is a center-left tech industry policy group. And so I have worked on a lot of these issues, have a lot of familiarity. This case is interesting. So this was the second case that the Department of Justice filed against Google on antitrust issues, and the topic was kind of a niche one, which is ad tech, the ad tech industry, and it really was alleging that Google had improperly linked the different parts of its ad tech business together in a way that had given it a monopolistic position. And the case moved relatively quickly. It moved for what's called the Rocket Docket, this court in Virginia that goes generally pretty fast. And
what does fast actually look like? When did it kick off? And obviously they got
this
to
one.
it.
So this one was filed. So this one was filed by the Biden administration. The other Google case, which had to do with Google's search distribution deals, was actually filed by the Trump administration.
Yep.
So this one, I think, took maybe a year from the time it was filed to the time it actually went to trial. So that's like relatively speedy.
Yep.
And they had there's a whole parade of people from the ad tech industry who testified as witnesses in this case, as well as like advertisers and publishers and kind of people from that world. But the trial ended, I think, in December, and then they just came out the verdict today. And there were some points for Google, but it was mostly a loss for them. The court found that they had improperly tied some of their ad tech products together, and they have a monopoly position in what's called the ad exchange, as well as the ad server, which is the tool that publishers use.
Can you break down? Can we kind of like go through a little bit more of your analysis? I'm curious to get kind of really your. I'd like to honestly hear your personal opinion on it. I don't know how much you can comment specifically. But do you think this was the right outcome? I know there was advertisers that use the platform that were testifying, saying like, look, we tried to use a lot of other alternatives and they just delivered inferior results. What's your read on it?
Okay, so I think the first thing you have to say is you have to back out and look at this industry, the ad tech industry, because it's sort of like famously complex. There's this famous chart called the Lumascape that shows all of the players in ad tech. And so on the one hand, you could say, okay, well, there's a lot of players, that's great. But on the other hand, one of the things that advertisers and publishers have said over the years is like, it's a little too complex, right? And what an advertiser cares about is basically like finding the customer who's most interested in their ad. What the publisher wants is basically the best return on their ad space, right? And so the way that this industry evolved was frankly a little bit contorted, but Google stitched together, several products that basically ideally gave the publisher the ad that performed the best, and ideally put the ad for the advertiser in front of the person likely most interested in it, right? Now, other players in the ad tech industry complained. Basically, they said that Google made it too hard to interoperate with with different parts of its ad tech stack, like the ad exchange or the publisher ad server, right? And that was the heart of the case, right? That essentially that Google hadn't provided enough interoperability between these different parts of the ad tech stack. And so that was kind of the key question. Like in antitrust law, there's this kind of doctrine of tying, right? Which is basically, do you force people to take one product because they really want this other product, right? And that's like the heart of the case. And the judge today found that Google had improperly tied its ad tech products together, specifically the ad exchange, which is sort of the matching piece of the puzzle, with the ad server, which is the tool that publishers use. And so I think that we don't know. There'll be a second phase of this trial, which will look at the remedies, like what happens now, what has to change in Google's business. That'll happen later this year. But to me, the big kind of strange thing about this case, I will say, is that like if you look at this part of Google's business, this is part of what's called their network business, which is basically like serving ads on other people's websites. This is the part of Google's business that's actually shrinking. So it was like 16% of their business like 5 years ago, and now it's down to like 11%. And you start to say like, okay, why? Well, what's happened is that business of placing ads across the internet has just declined because people
Wasn't it because of Google's product? They're doing AI summaries in some way.
And,
It's like
and
I don't need
people
to
are
run
on YouTube and social networks, right?
And one of the things is like there's so much less purchasing activity being driven by these ads because the targeting is worse. And you're there on a website usually to get information or to do something, not to you're not just sort of passively scrolling.
Other stuff, right? Yeah.
You're nailing all the reasons, right? Which is basically like this market that, in every antitrust case, you have to define what market you're talking about here, right? And here, really, they were talking about, I think it was called like the open internet advertising market, right? But like that's shrinking, right? Because people are spending more time within ecosystems, right? Within Google, within Meta's services, within Amazon, right? And those are actually increasing their share of digital advertising. So, one of the critiques I think of antitrust, sometimes you hear from people is like it moves too slow, or it's like fighting yesterday's battle. And
we saw that earlier with the FTC lawsuit and Meta about Instagram, an acquisition that happened a decade ago.
Totally. I mean, it's probably very funny because like these things are all happening. This is like high season for antitrust right now in DC where I live.
Yeah, totally.
Because the FTC trial is going on downtown. Next week, the remedies phase of the other Google case starts, and then this one comes down. So it's like high season for this stuff.
Yeah,
but I mean the FTC. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, with Google specifically, like, how does this play out? What is the remedy? It clearly matters to the businesses that feel, and the judge says, have been sort of wronged by Google's actions. But for the average consumer, it's just, I don't even know if it, I don't see this sort of hitting even headlines in the same way that, obviously Meta's, Instagram issue has.
That's totally right. This has always been a very kind of in the weeds, more obscure case. And one of the things that is kind of interesting is that like, there's no doubt like this is a loss for Google. It's probably a win for Google's competitors in ad tech. The big question mark in my mind is like, is it good or is it bad for advertisers and publishers, right? Because I think on the one hand, like advertisers and publishers some of them say like, we feel a little bit beholden to Google and we don't like that, right? On the other hand, like, and this came out at trial, like advertisers say like their performance by placing ads in Google is really good, right? Google's putting their ads in front of people who need it. They're getting good clicks. Publishers are getting good revenue. And it could be that in breaking apart like this system that's working well for advertisers and publishers, that they end up kind of regretting, this whole thing, right? So I'm interested to see whether that happens. But you're right. Like the next phase is going to be a remedies trial. And what happens? I mean, it kind of depends on how aggressively the government wants to pursue remedies against Google, right? Because you can sort of see, and the judge said today, basically, like, you have to submit initial proposals to her within like the next week. So this is going to come pretty fast. And so the most aggressive is like Google's ad tech business is broken up, right? So she says Google has to sell maybe its ad exchange business or its ad server business, the part that works for publishers. That would be probably the most aggressive. The less aggressive
and
version
to be
of that
clear
would be,
for the audience, that's not like AdSense. That has nothing to do with Google.
That's not AdSense.
AdWords. It doesn't have anything to do with like they might. Is it possible that Google could say like, cool, we're, it's not going to like materially damage the business one way or another. So it's maybe a little carrot that they give, or is that even not the right way to think about it?
Well, in fact, there was some reporting before this trial started that Google had supposedly tried to engage the Justice Department in settlement talks, right? And so you could have imagined like, okay, maybe they would have gone for something there. I don't know. I think we'll see what happens. But you're absolutely right. It's not AdWords, it's not AdSense. This is their publisher side tool and the ad exchange, which most people do not know about. Most even this is really like publishers and advertisers know this. The less aggressive remedy, I think, would be something like, okay, you can continue to operate these services, but we're going to mandate like maximum interoperability. Basically, like every part of your ad tech stack has to interoperate with other services, basically. And so that would be like the less aggressive version. We'll see. We'll see which one prevails.
Is the consumer harm standard just like completely out the window now? Did Lena Khan just like completely wipe that? Because I understand that if I'm a rival advertising platform, I'm upset about this. But if you're a consumer, there's maybe hard to prove harm. And even if you're an advertiser, you're probably like, hey, as long as the ad rates are good and I'm getting good ROI, I'm happy. So how did this come together? And are we just completely past the consumer harm standard at this point?
I fear that we're kind of beyond it. I think in in this case, the consumers were the advertisers and the publishers, though. Like there was never really any serious allegation that like this had an effect on the end consumer.
Sure.
The judge's decision, like her argument, her ruling was that Google's link between these products was unfair to Google's advertiser and publisher customers. And so like I think in her way she was applying the consumer welfare standard. But whether that, Google's going to appeal the case, right? That'll definitely happen. And one of the big cases that's a challenge for the court here is this case called Trinco, which is old Supreme Court precedent, which basically has to do with what's called the duty to deal, which basically says like, do you as a business, even like a dominant business, have an obligation to help your rivals? And she, in her ruling today, she did what I would call a creative interpretation to kind of get around that. That is the biggest question about whether this ruling survives appeal, and even up to the Supreme Court, because that the creativity, you call it, of her ruling may not survive appeal. We'll see.
Yeah. Do you think that there's just zooming out, like a shift in the government perception around just big businesses, even if they maybe are monopolies, but they're not causing consumer harm? We saw this Lena Khan taking a shot at Amazon, like they're clearly dominant, but is there consumer harm? Debatable, but it's still, let's put the screws to them. And JD Vance kind of said the same thing with Google. He said, yeah, that's a big company, maybe too big. Maybe we'll keep some of that pressure on them, even though it doesn't necessarily fit the previous definition of the monopoly test. Just market concentration is enough to merit a response from the government. And like, how do you think the perception around that shifts? And do you have a particular take on just like the idea of big companies that are dominant?
Well, so it's very interesting. So like when I worked at Google, one of the things I really admired this, because I don't think this is necessarily true today. Like my boss said, look, we're a big company. We have a lot of power. We're very influential. Like, let's not try to, fool anybody, right?
Yeah.
And I agree with that. Like big companies should absolutely be more scrutinized, be held to a higher standard. Like, absolutely, that's true. But what happened with these federal antitrust cases? So now every big tech company has an antitrust case pending against it from the federal government. Apple, Google, Meta, Amazon. What happened was about 6 years ago, the FTC and the Justice Department, they share responsibility for antitrust. They got together and they basically struck a deal. And they said, okay, FTC, you get Meta and Amazon, and DOJ, you get Google and Apple, right? And so they split up the companies based on the target, not the subject matter. And I think just human psychology, once you've done that, you're going to bring a case. So I think what happened in those cases was they had the target in mind, and then they worked to find a case they could bring, right? And so I think that's why these cases have varying degrees of strength to them, because they started with the target in mind and then they figure out the case, rather than looking holistically in industry and seeing if there's a problem. So I don't think that was the most principled way of going about that. But I think that's what happened. Now, one of the things that is very interesting is that okay, Trump crowd, the thing they actually care most about is censorship and speech, right? So it's really kind of strange, bizarre. I think today, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, she did a statement about this ruling, and she said, she made some reference in there about how this is great because, we're cracking down on Google because they've censored, conservative speech. The case has nothing to do with that whatsoever.
But it is tit for tat.
Well, I just think like this wasn't the Trump crowd's case. Right.
Yeah.
But I don't think the Trump
Yeah.
crowd really cares about Google's
Yeah.
ad
I
tech
mean, looking
business.
at other motivations,
You know?
is there a world where, the current administration seems very fixated on increasing revenues and decreasing costs? And is there a world where if you can just go around and get, I think they were asking Meta for $6 billion to settle that case. Is there a way that it's just like,
more
hey,
like
look,
it was
30
billion.
oh yeah, 30 billion.
30 billion.
30 billion.
Yeah.
Is there a world where it's like, hey, like we're just going to give out some parking tickets to try and raise some revenue? Is that like a rational thought experiment?
Yeah, to me, the fact they were willing to settle it for 30 billion kind of shows that they didn't really care about the case they brought in the first
They
place,
just wanted
right?
money.
Because it was like, all right, we'll make it go, and it's just like putting a price tag on it, right?
Yeah.
Wait, yeah. Let's pivot to the Meta case because you were sharing about that yesterday. You had said that the $30 billion settlement offer is 7 times the FTC's annual budget. So outlandish that the point would be humiliation, not restitution. How do you think the trial went yesterday for Zuckerberg? John was sharing that he looked absolutely fantastic in a suit.
He looked great.
It's unfortunate that anytime you see a tech CEO in a suit, they're in
Being
trouble.
punished.
Yeah.
But what's your read on the whole situation? And I'm curious, did you think that the original $450 million offer was a good starting offer for Zuck, and maybe they could have found some middle ground between 450 and 300 billion, because he was being kind of like run through the mud for even offering $450 million. But he's a businessman. I imagine he expected them to counter and like kind of meet in the middle or something like that. But what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, so you're absolutely right. Can't blame him for trying. Like, look, if the worst case they lose the case, they're forced to spin off Instagram and WhatsApp. Like, if you could avoid that outcome, every CEO would try to avoid that outcome, right, through a settlement. So don't begrudge them that.
But if he was truly worried about WhatsApp and Instagram being spun off, wouldn't he have come in and said, "Yeah, we'll pay like $10 billion because I really don't want that to happen"? Right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
I don't know. I mean, the reality is, like, I think what they have to balance that against is like how confident are they in their own case. And frankly, I think the FTC has a really tough case there.
Yeah,
because
that's what I'm saying. I think
you said this was a dozen years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no. I was saying specifically, they have to feel pretty confident in their case if there wasn't, a middle number that they were really wanting to anchor.
Yeah.
Just for reference, Meta has $77 billion in cash and short-term investments.
That's what I'm saying, and they're willing to
spend. Give us half.
Yeah. They're willing to say no, and they're willing to say we're going to spend $80 billion a year on capex,
and the metaverse is going to be a huge R&D expense. So.
Yeah, I have to imagine.
Well, by the way, just because it didn't get settled now doesn't mean it won't get settled later.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
And sometimes that depends on how the trial goes. Yeah. Right.
Makes sense.
And frankly, like if the FTC, like at the end of this trial, feels like they might lose, like maybe they'd accept a lower number. Yeah. So you kind of never know how that's gonna play out. But yeah, I think like the challenge for the FTC, like they have two problems. One is they have to say essentially that Facebook, that Meta doesn't compete with TikTok, right? Mm-hmm. And X, like that's a problem for them. Yeah. But the other is that they have to prove monopolization, basically that if Meta hadn't acquired Instagram or WhatsApp, they would have gone on to like challenge them and be great competitors. Like these were really small companies at the time they were acquired, right? Mm-hmm. And credit where it's due. I mean, Meta did a great job of integrating those companies, making them successful. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you guys have seen plenty of failed acquisitions where it's just like, it's like it just doesn't work. Like it's really hard to successfully integrate a company and like legitimately like 1 + 1 = 3.
And one interesting data point. So when Instagram was acquired, they had 300 million users, and Be Real, which was the last breakout consumer mobile app, has 40 million users. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it's probably not worth anywhere close to $1 billion, right? Even for someone like Meta, who has a consistent playbook of integrating that kind of business into the platform.
Yep.
Well, they also like Meta knows like they're in this business where like you have the most fickle customers ever, right? Like no young person is on the Facebook app, right? And then like very few really young people are on Instagram, right? So like social networking is a very like kind of like generational thing, right? And so it's very hard to like maintain kind of the zeitgeist in their business for like multiple generations. I think that's like a structural challenge for them. So
Yeah.
On
yeah,
the
anyway, so I think FTC has an uphill battle with that case.
do you
Yeah, I
think
agree.
these are kind of the wrong problems to be working on generally, as we like, you know, the entire internet is about to be steamrolled and the economy is about to be steamrolled by AI? Like, do you think it's a big sort
Yeah.
of distraction to just be arguing, you know, over acquisitions that happened more than a decade ago, when it feels, you know, like we have this revolution in many ways that has already started?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, like, I think a lot was very popular for politicians to say things like, we got to beat China in AI. Well, like, who do you think is going to do that? It's going to be Google, Meta, OpenAI, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be Anthropic. It's going to be those companies,
Yeah,
right?
arguably a Meta without an Instagram is a much weaker product. They can't invest in as much in CapEx. They can't invest as much as in Llama. Like maybe Llama
Yep.
3 doesn't get built because they're making half as much cash flow or something, you know. There's a bunch of interesting ways where you get a piece dividend from the market concentration. And that's the question about monopolies. Like if there's no consumer harm, the product's free and it's really good, and their whole North Star is like let's please the customer, like Bezos always says, customer comes first, all that. But then you also get these crazy dividends when they go and build cool stuff out there. Like it's kind of an awesome system, even though it makes it hard to compete with them. But I don't know. What's your take?
Well, I just think, I guess the way I come to it is like, I tend to think of like all of the big companies like intensely paranoid about each other.
Sure.
And like they're always getting into each other's spaces too,
Oh yeah,
right?
totally.
And so like to me, like that part of competition is sometimes overlooked in the way I'm like, yeah, you like these guys are like at each other's throats.
Yeah,
and that's good, like ultimately, because then that
Yeah.
competition is leading to them
Yeah.
to add features and like good for product innovation.
Yeah. I mean, every single big tech company overlaps with another one in one way or another, whether it's Amazon overlapping in ads now, Bing has a search engine, Google has a phone, like everyone's in everyone's spaces constantly.
Yeah.
And it's inevitable.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
I think it's wonderful,
Well, it's been great chatting with you. This was fantastic. We'll have to have you on the next time that there's a big FTC case or big case.
Just
This is fantastic.
DM us when you think there's a story that you're excited about talking about, and you can be one of our Hill correspondents.
Yeah. Congressional correspondent. All right.
Yeah, this is fantastic. We'll talk to you later.
Great.
Bye.
Great to meet you.
Talk soon.
Cheers.
Bye.